Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Podium Pod, the podcast covering the 2023 FIBA World Cup, brought to you by pickandroll.com.au. I'm Adam Webster, and I'm your host over the next 5 weeks as we travel to Japan, Indonesia, and the Philippines in pursuit of the Naismith Cup, the World Cup for 2023. I'm joined by my Clutch Radio broadcast partner, Jacob Doole. Jacob, you're heading over to a couple of destinations overseas, so welcome to the show. Looking forward to corresponding with you as you travel across this tournament.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's nice to be talking again in a little bit of a different setting to usual. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting over to Japan and the Philippines and following the Boomers as they chase that elusive gold medal this time around.
And also joined for the very first time by Ben Mallis. Ben, you'll be based in the Philippines for the entire tournament. So an enjoyable experience for you ahead. Have you ever been to the Philippines before?
I have not. I actually have an office for my work in Manila that I'll be lucky enough to go visit when the World Cup is on as well. So it's actually been on the to-do list for a little while. So looking forward to checking out Manila, looking forward to some warmer weather. The winter here in Melbourne has worn me down. So I can see Jacob shaking his head in agreement. So bring on the warm weather. I'll happily take that over the cold here.
And you don't even have to take annual leave. How good's that? You've swindled that very, very well, Ben. Congratulations to you.
No, thank you. Thank you. I'm just honoured to be joining Tasmania's basketball duo here. This is good fun.
We do have a fourth member of the team as well. It would be remiss if I didn't bring into the conversation Tom Hersz. Tom will be joining us for our preview episodes, as well as he will be traveling across to Japan for the group stages. So looking forward to chatting to Clutch Radio and NBL.com.au's Tom Hersz across the tournament as well. I wanted to start the season, I guess, of our podcast by talking about the Boomers, because that's kind of what brought us all to the dance here. For me personally, I remember thinking about this a while ago. I've been a footy fan and a basketball fan my whole life, but I don't think there's a team that I've resonated with quite as much as the Boomers, which is a weird thing to say given they only play sort of every couple of years for any length of time. So they've been a huge part of my life, my whole life. And guys, I'm interested in who your favorite Boomer is of all time. Jacob, we'll start with you. Do you have a particular player that embodies why you love the Boomers, or a guy that comes to mind first when you think about the Boomers?
Yeah, as I look just to my right in my home office here and have a Paddy Mills in his Boomers jersey sort of looking down on me, that feels like the obvious answer. I think it would be for a lot of people. He does sort of sum up that Boomers spirit, that team culture, and he really drives that still now, which I think connects with a lot of people. If I'm going a little bit more left field, which I will try to, just to avoid following the crowd too much, Chris Goulding's a player as well that I've always loved to watch. When I moved over to Melbourne for a few years, he was playing for United, and I really enjoyed watching him there. He sort of drew me into the NBL, and for the Boomers, I feel like he's always just had this knack for stepping up in the big moments and making things happen, and maybe being a little bit of a pest as well, which I think is something very Australian too out on the court. So I think there's a lot to like about what he's done over these years.
Jacob, you and I love a good pest in a basketball game. That's one of our favourite
roles. We've talked about this often.
Absolutely. Ben, what about you? You've obviously been overseas. You've covered NBA. You've been with the pick and roll for over a decade now. Who is your number one favourite Boomer? It doesn't have to be the best Boomer of all time, but who's your guy?
Well, I think we're going to get on very well on this podcast because that makes us three all in the same mold that love a good pest on the basketball court. And that's leading into my name of Damian Martin. So this is definitely a homer pick, West Australian kid here, born and raised in Perth. That Damo was the first basketball player I ever interviewed. And again, we all think about to his moment he had in 2016 going up against Kevin Durant. He clearly wasn't the best player, clearly not the most athletic, is a real embodiment of where the Boomers program used to be and kind of, to be honest, where it's graduated past. But it was players like Damian Martin that laid the foundation for, again, my time following the sport. And he just embodies everything that is great about our program. So, yeah, Damo is the name that always sticks out when people ask me this question.
A great answer. I'm going to throw two. An honourable mention. The first basketball player I ever interviewed was Chris Anstey, and he was so giving of his time. So that was a really biased pick from me of just a guy that was willing to give his time and was a really nice guy. And you want to see those people succeed. But the guy that I've watched over many years and just really enjoyed because for me, he embodies the fact that you don't need to score. You don't need to be the top scorer on the team and take all the shots. You've just got to do the little things well and do everything you can for your team. And that's Joe Ingles. I've always loved Joe. He's crafty and he affects the box score in so many different ways. He affects the game in so many different ways. So for me, I've always had a soft spot for Joe Ingles. He also seems like just a cracking guy as well, as they all do. I think that's probably the other reason that it's so easy to love this team, because we have such a high character organization in Australian basketball, and you can't really get into that team unless you are of high character. We've seen that time and time again. So Joe Ingles for me, but good answers all around, guys. And I look forward to seeing many pests across the world of FIBA basketball in this tournament. We've got plenty of those to talk about. We'll talk about what we've got to look forward to over the next 5 weeks. We'll do some group previews. We'll be previewing every single one of the 8 groups of 4 teams in the FIBA World Cup. We'll also review the exhibition games that are coming up in Melbourne. I know, Ben, you'll be around for those, as well as Tom. And then we'll be covering, of course, the group stage for every single Boomers game in the tournament, as well as the rest of the tournament. I mean, we can't leave out the remaining teams. There'll be a lot of fantastic basketball played. There'll be some players that really stamp their authority on the basketball world, as they always do in international play. And Jacob, I put this to you. Do you have an under-the-radar player ahead of our group previews across the rest of the tournament that you're really looking forward to watching in this one?
Geez, that's a very good question, because as you say, when you look at all of these rosters, there's just so much talent sort of across the board. We talk about how Australian basketball is growing, and Ben, I like what you said about the Boomers sort of outgrowing players like Damian Martin, as important as they were. And I think every other country at this tournament kind of is looking fairly similar, because they're just all getting so much better at a rapid pace. But for the player I'm looking forward to, I'll take a little bit of an older head for Brazil. Marcelo Huertas, still hanging in there in the Brazilian national team. One of my favorite players when he was on the Lakers, even though he barely played. I think he can still make some flashy dimes. He can still make some good plays for Brazil, and they'll be a team to watch as well. So the old man's still got a bit in his legs, I think, even with all the up and coming talent.
Ben, have you got a favorite or a deep cut that you want to tell us about that you're really looking forward to seeing?
This isn't much a deep cut. This is my NBA fandom flowing through, and again, a very big name, so it's not a deep cut. But Shai Gilgeous-Alexander on Team Canada. I was having a chat with someone this morning, and we actually clued in that he is going to be the best player in the World Cup. Obviously, Luka Doncic is playing there, so maybe I've just undone myself there. But Luka, I don't think Luka has a right to be winning the tournament because he doesn't have enough talent around him. But I really think that Team Canada team is really deep. And I can see a scenario, obviously, the Australian in me hopes this doesn't happen, but I can see a scenario in a month's time where Canada is storming into the final, and Shai is seen as the best player in the tournament, taking over the world. So again, this guy has established himself in the NBA, but I feel like if it goes to plan for him in Canada, this could be the month where he really breaks out as a legitimate top 5 consensus player in the world, if Canada can perform at the level I think they will be doing over the next month.
Ben, it's funny you say that, because I had a very similar conversation with someone just yesterday about how Canada probably has the best roster in this World Cup.
Agreed. And so deep.
You wouldn't have believed it, even a year ago, but the USA team just isn't quite so strong as it's been in previous tournaments. That being said, I'm going to go down your track, and I'm going to pick the main guy for the main team that I support, and I have a separate podcast for. Tyrese Haliburton is playing in this World Cup. And I love Tyrese Haliburton. He's my favorite player. I am tremendously biased, but I'm looking forward to seeing how he plays in international play. And as I said, I was listening to Trevor Gleeson talk about how Lauri Markkanen stamped himself on the international stage last year in the qualifiers, or in the Eurobasket. But Tyrese Haliburton is one guy, along with a lot of these guys in the USA team, that could propel themselves into all NBA contention this season. There's at least 1 or 2 guys in every single international tournament that raises their level of play during that USA summer and comes into the USA winter season primed and ready to go and ready to be an all-star and a superstar player. And for me, I'm crossing my fingers and toes that that's Tyrese Halliburton this time around. Let's also have a chat about training camp. I mean, the Boomers have such a task ahead of them to whittle their team down from 18 to 15 and then to 12. And Ben, I'll start with you this time. And it's probably the most competitive squad I would say that Australia's ever gone into a training camp with. And you could literally pick any 15 of those guys to go to exhibition, any 12 of those 15 to go to Japan, and you would have arguments about the other 6. It's a ridiculous amount of talent that Australia has to choose from this time around.
Yeah, it really is the maturation of the program, and everything that we've been speaking about for the past 10 to 15 years is starting to come to the surface now, where we've got, I think the number's 10 NBA players, which is obviously a very easy way of tracking this. But then you've got players like Nick Kay, for example, who's making big bucks in Asia and is elevated to a point now where he leaves the NBL and goes over to Asia. So I think you look at the roster, you're spot on. There is so much depth. There is so much talent. I do believe the top 6 or 7 players do pick themselves. Like, we'll get into this, but obviously the Josh Giddeys, the Patty Mills, the Joe Ingleses of the world pick themselves. But players 9 through 17, 9 through 16, call it what you want, you could be seeing any of those players get on the plane to Manila. And someone like Chris Goulding's come up a couple of times on this podcast already. For me, he has to be on the plane, given he has a skill set that we don't have. But putting him on that roster, look down at you like, who are we going to have to leave off to get him on the plane? And that's one of many examples. So spot on. It's deeper than ever. There's more competition than ever. And the best part is we've got Giddey, we've got Dyson Daniels, we've got Matisse coming back, Josh Green. These young 20-somethings are really taking over. And it's time now for them to take the baton and really run with this program for the next decade.
And leading into Paris, the next World Cup, Los Angeles, and even Brisbane, I mean, we've got a team of guys that will play in all of those tournaments moving forward. Brisbane's a short 9 years away. Josh Giddey will be entering the prime of his career at that point in time. So that's super exciting, particularly with a home Olympics on the distant horizon. And Jacob, I'll go to you next. It's interesting to look at this squad and consider that Brian Goorjian and Trevor Gleeson and his team will have to leave 3 people out of this squad going into those exhibition games. Do you have any sense of who is going to be left off the squad? Dare I ask, because we'll go into the group previews. We probably won't have another show live prior to the exhibition games. So it's getting down to to prediction time.
It is, and as Ben said, top to bottom, this is such a strong roster. I feel like every time I look through the list, name by name even, you go, I can see that player playing a role for the Boomers at a World Cup. And that's every single player on the list, even the ones that maybe are less likely to make the team. So there are going to be some tough cuts. I think if you do look sort of towards the bottom end in terms of raw talent on this team, but beyond those NBA guys, there's some players like your Sam Frollings and your Will McDowell-Whites who have been rewarded with selection in this squad after playing a really massive role in the Asia Cup and the qualifying campaigns. And it's certainly not impossible to envision them having a really strong training camp and maybe forcing people to take notice, forcing the coaches to consider them. I think someone like McDowell-White especially could come into his own in that Boomers environment and do well. But I think if you had to make a pick right now, it would be a few of those NBL guys who would be the first to drop off the end. Frolling, Pinder, McDowell-White, and maybe even a Thon Maker who comes in as a little bit of a mystery at this stage as to what shape he's in, what kind of form he would bring into camp.
Ben, FIBA's a whole different ball game. You know, it plays much bigger than the NBA, and it plays much, much bigger than the NBL as well. We've seen NBL teams at times not even field a center in the past season. So when you look at guys like Duop Reith, Keanu Pinder, Thon Maker, Jock Landale, Sam Froling, Xavier Cooks, you have to take as many of those guys over as possible to be able to guard the bigger European teams, don't you? I mean, you have to at least carry, 3 or 4 big men on this squad.
Agreed. And I think looking back to the Olympics 2 years ago is the place to start there. And we remember Nick Kay did great things. Landale did great things, got better. And Reith served a role on that Olympic squad. And for mine, they're the three core big men that need to be part of that roster. And then that fourth big man / hybrid player, that is one of the biggest questions looking at this roster. You're right. Do you go down the path of Xavier Cooks, who can play up, who's very light and probably will get bashed around a little bit? But at the same time, if we think about what the Boomers are going to be needing in the semi-finals in a tight game against Spain, I think that's how we have to be approaching this, because no offense to Finland, but if we can't beat Finland with any of these guys, then what's the point of expecting to win gold? We need to be looking ahead to those semi-finals and thinking about what 5-man groups are going to allow us to play those games well. And I think that's going to involve a lot of switching, a lot of size on the perimeter to make up for the big guys inside. And so those three names I said before, Kay, Landau, and Reith, I think that's enough to hold it down. Obviously, you don't hope injuries come into it, but I think they're the three names that I can see playing in those high leverage moments. So as much as it might put us at risk earlier in the tournament, I probably would lean to adding another perimeter player. Example of Chris Goulding, right? I would pick Chris Goulding over Thon Maker because Goulding can shoot the ball. So I think we need to accept that there's going to have to be some give and take. And for the fourth big man spot, that's what I'm thinking. I might be going a bit smaller to get rangier defenders out onto the court. Because again, against Team USA, like if Tyrese Halliburton's on the court, like I'm sorry for Thon, but Thon's got no chance of keeping up. You're going to need that size on the perimeter.
It's going to come down to a couple of different battles, and I'm going to throw out a couple to you guys, Jacob, starting with you. Will McDowell-White versus Matthew Dellavedova is probably going to be right there or thereabouts the battle that has to be won or lost prior to the exhibition games. Now, maybe both miss out when it's all said and done on going overseas, but you probably have to leave one of them out in the exhibition games. For me, it's probably Dellavedova because you want to give Will McDowell-White as much time around this team as humanly possible. Iron sharpens iron, as they say. But for you, what are your thoughts on Delly versus Will McDowell-White?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I don't think there's any question that McDowell-White is more of a player towards the future for the Boomers. Dellavedova, he's been, an all-time great in the Boomers setup, but he is coming towards the end of his career. So really, I think which one of them you would take into those exhibition games comes down to, do you value more that eye to the future, that extended run for McDowell-White in with the squad, or would you rather keep Dellavedova's leadership and his sort of knowledge of the Boomers system, his presence as an extra coach almost on the floor? Do you value that more in a training camp or an exhibition game scenario? So I think if we were looking purely at picking your best possible team for those exhibition games, I would be taking McDowell-White for everything that he can do. But I wouldn't be surprised either if Dellavedova was kept just for those sort of intangibles and that off-the-court impact that he can have.
Ben, Delly's been so good for so long. Is it, superfluous to have a guy of his character on the team just because you have so many other high-character guys?
It kind of feels like we're shooting Bambi here, doesn't it? Talking about Delly's spot on the team. Again, for mine, this comes down to it almost, I think it's prudent to look at this from an old school coaching mindset, because again, if I flash forward to the end of the tournament, if Delly or White are playing big minutes, then we're probably not going to be winning these big high leverage games. And so this debate for me comes down to, what do you value more from your 11th and 12th man? Is it someone like McDowell-White that, again, he's going to get great experience, going to build more for the future, but he's probably not going to play? Or on the flip side with Delly, again, he's probably not going to play, but if the shit's hitting the fan for 5 minutes in a semi-final, you know that he can at least go in there. The moment's not going to be too big for him. And then you've obviously got all of the intangible aspects that he would bring. So I agree with Jacob. If you're ranking players 1 through 12, like NBA 2K, Delly isn't in the squad. He's probably not in the top 15. But when you look at the balance of a roster, and again, we look back 4 years ago when Jonah Bolden cracked it and left the team because he wasn't playing, like, you don't want that happening again. So I actually think, as much as I think Delly's over the hill, he probably is the perfect guy to sit on the end of the bench in Manila because he has that experience. And as I say, if it's all going to hell, I would trust him in those 5 minutes more than I would McDowell-White or Sam Froling or Thon Maker, simply because he's been there and seen it all before.
Are those the three? You mentioned three names there. So, Ben, are those the three that are logically probably left out of the next phase here? Are we talking Sam Froling, Will McDowell-White, and probably Thon Maker? Is there anyone else? I guess Keanu Pinder's probably the other one that could be left out.
Pinder's the one, isn't he, that is also in addition to those guys. But again, the training camp, right? I'm sure that I heard Gorgon speak, I think it was this morning or yesterday, and he was basically saying that he kind of knows where he's going with most of the roster, and it's just a case of having this week in camp to use the word figure it out, which I take as coach speak for lying. So I think they know where they're going. But it might be a case of bringing all the big men down to Melbourne and just seeing who sticks and seeing what works. So you could, again, hypothetically, if Dellavedova isn't going to make it, I'm pretty sure they'd know that by now. I don't think he's going to be a last-minute cut. So if that's the case, I wouldn't be surprised if they pull him and pull White before they get down to Melbourne, because they need to be using these games to find out what rotations work. So again, Sam Froling, I don't think he's going to be on the plane to Manila. I wouldn't pick him to come down to Melbourne. But if they want to throw a bunch of crap against the wall and see what sticks, then it probably does make sense to bring the big guys down to Melbourne and see if they can strike lightning in a bottle and just see what they can find.
Jacob, I'm going to throw one more little battle at you, and this is probably not a battle for this cut, but maybe the next one, and that's Jack White and Xavier Cooks. I feel like there's probably only a spot for one of those two guys on this squad. Who has the edge for you right now?
It's a really tough one, isn't it? Because both are coming off just really strong seasons. You know, Jack White tore up the G League. I think he was better there than anyone expected. Xavier Cooks, NBL MVP, into a little cameo for the Washington Wizards in the NBA, where he certainly didn't look out of place. And the simplistic way of looking at it in my mind is they're both really, really strong defenders. They're both going to give you plenty on that end. Not identical players, but you can back them in to hold their own defensively. And so offensively, it kind of comes down to, what do you value more, the extra shooting of Jack White or the bit of playmaking, sort of off the dribble, acting as a connector that Xavier Cooks has? And I'd imagine that'd be a little small part of the calculation that Brian Goorjian and his staff are thinking of. And for me at this stage, I think I'd lean slightly towards Jack White, just because I think in FIBA basketball, when things can get so cramped anyway with the reduced 3-point line, I think that bit of extra shooting could be important at some point if he was to come on and play minutes in an important moment.
Ben, I'll ask you to leave your Thunder bias at the door, given you've already shown a little bit of Thunder bias to Giddy, but with White signing, Cooks versus White, who has the edge for you?
It's actually Cooks for me. And again, the thing that I'm keep coming back to is athleticism and movement on the perimeter. And I know that's not Cooks' game when we've seen him dominating the NBL. But again, I'm thinking about 5-minute spurts to throw a second man at Luka Doncic, or to throw a second man at Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I know he's not going to stop those players. Either is Jack White. But I think Cooks just brings a different dimension to the squad, because you're right about the size in FIBA. He is a 4/5, probably more towards a 5 in an ideal world. But we look at the combination of, again, Landale and Kay. They're great players. They're very strong, beefy inside. But I think I can see lineups where Cooks is stealing a couple of minutes alongside those guys, with his long, rangy limbs on the weak side being that disrupting presence. So that's what I'd favour. And Jacob mentioned a very good point regarding his connector play on offense. Again, we harken back to what Aaron Baines and Andrew Bogut did in the Boomers setup. I know it's not the same. Cooks isn't on their level. But that DHO game and that movement game is something the Boomers have been implementing, and at their best they play. So I think Jack White is too similar to the other big man. I would take Xavier Cooks as, again, an X factor that can sit on the bench and come in when we need that jolt of athleticism.
How good is it to be having these discussions about two players who are essentially in the NBA, and one of them is going to be missing out from a Boomers team? These are not conversations I thought we'd ever be having maybe 10 years ago.
It's amazing to know that, you know, over half of this squad is in the NBA. It's not something that you would have expected. And Ben, it's a wonderful problem to have that, you know, as I say, it doesn't really matter what 15 players you take to these exhibition games. We know that we have a strong squad. Yeah,
and the craziest thing is the NBA All-Star I followed around in Philadelphia 4 years ago is dropped off the face of the earth and not on the team. Yeah. So it's crazy how much depth there is. And like Jacob said, it's I think there's two ways to approach this. There's obviously it's objectively cool and it's a great moment, but at the same time, we also need to be mature as a basketball public and say that, all right, it's time to go now. The pressure's on. It's time to actually expect a medal and expect to be winning these tournaments. So that's something that I want to chronicle over the next month. It's like, it's wonderful that we've seen this growth, but this team needs to be winning games. And what they did 2 years ago in Tokyo was great, but it's just elevated the standard. And this team needs to be competing for medals now, because talent is no longer an excuse. they actually have more cohesion than most teams. So it's go time in my eyes. And this is the best chance they've had yet to actually win a tournament happening over the next month.
For the last 30 years, the USA has looked at the players that it's left at home, and those players could have won a medal. So it's nice for Australia to finally have a position where the players that we're leaving home we're arguing about, and we're wondering if, you know, those guys could have contributed more. It's a really good sign for the Boomers. So, all right, the 3 players that are missed out of the exhibition, I'm going to ask you guys for 3 very clear predictions. Who are the first 3 out of this Boomers squad, Jacob?
I'll say Sam Froling, Thonmaker, and Will McDowell-White. Don't feel great about that last one, though.
Ben, what about you?
I will say Froling, Pinder, and actually Jack White. I think he might be the game. Again, It's a bit of a trust in my gut there that he won't be making the plane to Manila. But yeah, they're the 3 names that, if you're asking me, that I would be letting go at this stage.
For me, it's Froling, it's Pinder, and it's McDowell-White. I think that's probably the ideal for me. Delhi, you're right. You need guys that are happy to sit on the end of the bench, Ben, and I think Delhi is just the perfect guy. He's been doing that for many years now and playing a role when he's needed to. He's coming to the twilight of his career, and this is probably his last major tournament. So be good to see him out with gold. We will be with you across the entire tournament here on the Podium Pod, presented by thepickandroll.com.au. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to the group previews starting next week. We'll see you again next time.